Hey everyone, Anark here. This is another installment of Anark Abridged, which is where I just sit down and talk to the camera for about 30 minutes. And this video is going to be on the topic of a reading list that I've developed. I've been actually receiving requests for this since like very early on in the channel's history. And I've decided to just put together that reading list and then make a series of videos where I go through the reading list one by one and discuss with you why I think each of these are like worthy books to read. In part two, we spent most of our time on history books. The books, we got through most of that in that video, but we didn't finish maybe like the last three that I've got here. And then as we proceed through this video, after I'm done talking about those last few history books that I had on the list, we'll be moving on to the topic of intersectionality, queer, and trans anarchism, where there are texts that kind of cover that gamut. So the one of the three that we did not get to in the last video that was mostly about history is a book called The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Alexander Berkman was an anarchist around the time of the early 1900s. In fact, this was written in the time after the 1917 revolution in Russia. And it is essentially Alexander Berkman's diaries, having been deported from the United States to Russia during the time of the Russian Revolutionary War. So this is him recounting his experiences having arrived in Russia. His sort of, at first he had a very charitable opinion of the Russian Revolution, and he saw it as very hopeful, and he committed himself very deeply to fighting with the Russians in, establishing the USSR. However, the book recounts how Berkman's enthusiasm certainly died off. Little by little, he began to recognize the problems that had arisen in the USSR, why that it was I don't know if I would say doomed to fail, but that it was going to experience problems much like what we saw. It's essentially Berkman recounting the descent into authoritarianism during the war years, and lays out deep critiques of both the USSR itself, how it's structured, and the Bolsheviks themselves. It has some very moving passages in it, and I think it's really worth it for anyone to read. Next one on the list is, I think you would say this, Copay by the FAU, and it looks like it's COPEI, and those are all capitals. Honestly, I've looked for a little while to figure out if that stands for something, but I never actually found something that it stood for, so perhaps this is my ignorance speaking here. And the FAU was a group that I spoke of very briefly in part one of this series when I talked about especifismo. And the FAU is what later became the FARJ in Brazil. And it was an anarchist organization that was created before the rise of fascism in Brazil and before violent suppression took place. And it survived through violent suppression by the governments of that region. And what is Copay? Well, Copay is a piece that was written to sort of analyze what the conditions for armed guerrilla conflict were in that area of the time. So it speaks about what would now be Brazil, and it essentially lays out what their criticisms are of the dominant militant vanguard party, the MLN. And it lays out their criticisms more broadly with the method that was pioneered in Cuba called Focismo. And it gives all kinds of criticisms of why that their method did not work. And I would say it's extremely fair. This is not just the whole way through. It's not just criticism. It sort of regards that there are various things they did do right, and things that were presently being mimicked by the FAU. So what it is an internal document to inform people that were in the middle of the struggle, why did the MLN fail? And what is the difference between their methods and our methods? So, how do we learn from that, and how do we struggle more successfully? The reason I've included it is because it's like a history document, but it's also kind of a theory piece. It talks a lot about like what the general theory of struggle looks like. How does it work? What does it mean to be a militant as an anarchist? And what are the goals? It would go on to become a very important document for the praxis called especificismo more broadly. So it is very interesting. And I recommend if anybody is really interested in that sort of militant aspect and just wants to maybe understand a little bit of the context of especificismo in a historical sense, that they read it. I really, really enjoyed it. It was very interesting. The last one that I have on the history list is called Militant AntiFascism by M. Testa. So this book is... what I would say is it's, first of all, it's sort of a comprehensive history of a bunch of militant anti-fascist movements that have been carried out. And it's sort of the history of Antifa more broadly. Like, what is Antifa? What does it mean to be an anti-fascist? And what does it mean to struggle militantly against fascism? The book is just a compendium of different attempts, different methods that were used, historical accounts of those struggles all over the world. And I highly recommend it if what you are interested in is how do you successfully struggle against fascism. There are lots of examples for you to look at. And this book was one of the best ones I found, really just putting them all together. And I would say maybe even like an academic sort of context. So if that's what you're looking for, Militant Anti-Fascism by M. Testa is very good. So this now brings us to the section of texts in this reading list that are about intersectionality, queer, or trans anarchism. I guess, it might be said that trans issues could be considered a subsection of queer issues. But of course, that's a topic for dispute and discussion. But these are all going to appeal to that foundation. But what I want to also note here is that, a couple of these are actually just pretty good intros to anarchism more broadly, and I'll kind of note those as I go through. The first one in the list I have here is Queering Anarchism by a bunch of different authors. It's a compendium, so it's got all kinds of different essays on really just the intersection of queer theory and anarchism. So, it's called Queering Anarchism, and I suppose that is part of what it does, but it's really just about like, how do those two, how does queer theory and anarchism, how do those interact? What kind of insights can they derive from one another, and has a tendency more towards asking how anarchism can derive insights from queer theory, which honestly makes it sort of more valuable because, obviously there's been plenty of discussion of how, we can learn more broadly from anarchists. But here it talks about how anarchists should really take on board the advancements in queer theory, understand the struggles of queer people of various kinds, and how those apply to the anarchist struggle more broadly. And so one thing I also want to mention is this is one of those that I was talking about that just kind of presents a good intro to anarchism. I would say if you're coming from the perspective of a queer person who's interested in anarchism more broadly, this compilation of essays is really valuable, not just because of the things that are talked about in the compilation, which is really great. They span through all kinds of different topics, but there's also this sort of like editorial intro at the very beginning, which is really just a overall, it's just like an overview of what anarchism is. So it's almost like they recognized that there were going to be a lot of queer people, that this was going to be their introduction to anarchism. And it also kind of gives us some preparation of understanding of what queer theory is as well. So I think that, that it serves that purpose. But I also want to emphasize that it goes into all kinds of different topics that are related to queer theory. It not only talks about, the struggles of, say, gay people, but also people who are transgender, and also, might add, for example, things like polyamory and the discussion of what, sexual politics look like at that intersection of queerness and anarchism. So it's got a lot of commentary in it. And one of the things is it actually has numerous essays that kind of deal with like the internal functioning of organizations and how that relates to queer theory and queerness more broadly. So it has like, the essays are all over the place, so it's really hard for me to generalize, but it covers all kinds of different topics. I think that you'll probably end up developing like favorites out of the list. And it should be said, I think at least one of these that I'm going to list here is in it. In part, it's part of that compilation, but I want to kind of bring your attention to it separately. So that's Queering Anarchism. The next one on the list is Queers with Guns by Elisha Moon Williams. And it is actually a phenomenal intro to anarchism for queer people as well. But it's also kind of like framed in a discussion about the role of gun culture to queer people. And not only like a little bit of the history, but more like kind of trying to set apart the gun culture of mainstream America, these sort of toxically masculine, very patriarchal, very cis-heteronormative gun culture that exists. And it's kind of trying to point out that, a gun culture doesn't have to be that. Guns are probably going to be very necessary for queer people in defending themselves from the rise of reactionary violence that is currently taking place. And insofar as that's the case, the queer people are going to be required to develop a gun culture which is healthy and which actually goes towards creating a militant struggle to resist forces of reaction. And it also very conveniently kind of has like this like maybe kind of like introductory dialogue on what anarchism is. So we've actually found that we table this for a Scissortail Anarchist organization in Tulsa, and we found that this title is actually very helpful in a variety of ways because it's kind of provocative. So like there's a lot of queer people that are going to walk by and see the name. They're going to go, "Queers with Guns, huh?" And then that'll get them interested to read it. And it's it's not like clickbait or whatever you want to say, that is what it talks about, but it will also serve to introduce them to anarchism from a queer perspective. So highly recommend this one. And if you are an organization, you should also table it. The next one is also from her, and it is Queer Social Anarchism. And you might almost see this as like being a follow-up to the previous piece. In that previous piece, I would say this is a more social anarchist, this is a more social queer anarchism or queer social anarchism, whatever you want to say. And that is to say that there's a lot of literature out there about queer anarchism, which is focused around a sort of more egoist or individualist or insurrectionary perspective. And these two essays are more a social anarchist perspective. So that's not to say that they lack some of that insurrectionary character. I think there's certainly some of that in there. But it's not really an individualist anarchist approach, which there's plenty of. It is more a social anarchist approach. And being a social anarchist myself, I find that highly valuable. But she also lays out why she thinks it's valuable, why she thinks it's important. And this one is really, she makes the case even more strongly in this piece, Queer Social Anarchism. She is laying out why social anarchism is, a valuable trend in understanding queer struggle, especially as an anarchist. But it is also, might I add, kind of an interesting part, giving a sort of introduction to the organizational structure of especifismo, which, if you are paying attention to this reading list, you may have noticed kind of occurs regularly within this reading list. But she also agrees. She comes from the perspective that she thinks especifismo is a very modern praxis that we need to pay attention to. And it lays out how this praxis relates to the struggles of queer people, especially in the context of the United States. So we also table this one So if you are a queer person who is looking for a sort of introduction, and you're just looking for a couple essays, maybe some of these are just a little bit, maybe like Queering Anarchism is too much to start with. I think that Queers with Guns and Queer Social Anarchism are a great place to start. Next is Refusing to Wait by Shannon and Rogue. This one, I don't recall if it's this one or the next one that features in Queering Anarchism as part of that compendium, but nonetheless not really relevant. Refusing to Wait is like a dialogue about why intersectionality is important to anarchists. And might I add, it kind of is laying out, it's partially kind of critical of anarchists for having not come to an intersectional perspective beforehand, has a little bit of a historical retrospective of how that was harmful, and how anarchists were almost already getting there. Like they already had these ideas which were conducive to an intersectional perspective, but that they hadn't gone all the way, and how that had been a limitation. And this title, Refusing to Wait, it kind of refers to this idea that the anarchists of history, what you might find is that, this would have been an issue which was kind of sidelined. It's like they would have said, yeah, queer struggle, that's important, women's issues, that's important, race, that's important, but that stuff waits until after the revolution, right? And the title is therefore Refusing to Wait. It's saying, no, these things have to be resolved now. And this is one of the big things that I think intersectionality offers to anarchism, is that no, the economics cannot just be dealt with and then we'll fix the social problems later. That is not how this works. All of these hierarchies will have to be opposed now. That is part of the revolutionary process. They're refusing to wait. The next one on the list is Insurrections at the Intersections. And this one is by Volcano and Rogue. And Rogue was also one of those there with Refusing to Wait. So this one, Insurrections at the Intersections, I would say kind of in the opposite way is more saying, like, what does anarchism bring to intersectionality? Like, how do we create an intersectional anarchism or an anarchist intersectionality, right? It kind of discerns between those here as well. And it notes kind of some of the things that I was just intimating a moment ago, which is that intersectionality it comes very naturally to anarchism, because anarchism is, critiquing all forms of domination, all hierarchical power structures. And therefore, of course, all of these issues are going to be important. But it also lays out how intersectionality it has sort of been recuperated by liberalism, that it has a lot of liberals in it that are making it way less radical than it should be, that are reducing or trying to sideline or put in the back seat a class struggle perspective. And it rejects that. It says, that the class struggle is incredibly important, that, though it is the case that, the anarchists of history perhaps overemphasized it, it is still extremely important. We cannot take a liberal view on this, that, class, the problem is just, interpersonally, classism is bad, upper class people judging and critiquing lower class people and mistreating them, or lower class people judging and, being prejudiced against upper class people. It rejects that outright. That is not the struggle here. The struggle here is against the class system. In the topic of race, the struggle is against white supremacy. Similarly, in the topic of gender or sex, the struggle is against patriarchy or against cis heteronormativity, right? So it has to be against. It has to also be against structure. It has to recognize the importance of structure. And I think it's really valuable for that reason. It kind of offers why that we should be intersectional in our anarchism. The next one, and we're kind of, for these next two, we're getting off of them being explicitly anarchist, but they are very valuable on this topic of intersectionality and the interaction of intersectionality and anarchism. And this next one is the Combahee River Collective Statement by the Combahee River Collective. And this was where intersectionality began. So this was written by a group of black women who were very displeased with the liberal nature of feminism. They thought that it was wholly insufficient to deal with all of the intersections of a person's identity, that trying to boil somebody's identity down just to their gender and their experience of patriarchy was completely insufficient. And for them, what I think was the most important intersection for them to bring to the topic was that they were black women, that them being black was an important part of their identity, and that white feminism was largely erasing that it was trying to boil everything down to their gender experience, and that was insufficient. And so this was the beginning of intersectionality, really. Like this is where it sort of began, where this topic like roots from. It's the seed that was planted that became intersectional theory. So yeah, highly recommend reading that, brief statement for the most part, that gets across some of the foundations of intersectionality and intimates that critique. The last one is one that is just very popular that I've seen tabled so many times, and it's another word for white ally is coward by the AntiState St. Louis Collective or something. I saw them listed just as AntiState STL. So you can hear by the name, anti-state, that this is a more horizontalist perception, a conception, right? This is definitely, even though it's not, spending its time talking about anarchism more broadly, it's still by a collective, which is a more horizontal or anti-statist collective. And really the central thesis of this piece is just how allyship has become a sort of stand-in for effective action. When it's like the phrase itself has almost become a deflection from doing the important work. And it sort of like lays out this conception you may have broadly heard about accomplices, not allies, right? You can, there's this conception that you can almost like be an ally from the sidelines. What they're really trying to emphasize is that, if that's your conception of allyship, it's worthless. Another word for white ally is coward, right? We're looking for people that are going to participate in the struggle, who will be accomplices, as it's sometimes been said. And if you've heard that before, this is a great piece for becoming acquainted with why this language often gets used, and why you may have, for example, noticed that it featured in Black Lives Matter to some significant degree. Okay, so as in the previous videos, we are going to be moving into another topic. So I guess this one's got all kinds of different books on it. I don't know if that's good for the algorithm here, but we're also going to at least start into this list on Black anarchism. So I'm going to try to give each of these the time they deserve, because I don't want to try to just cram this in here. But, if we run out of time, we will continue in the next video. So the first one is just a talk by Ashanti Alston, and I've given a link to where it's just been transcribed, but it's a short talk about Black anarchism and the importance of Black anarchism by Ashanti Alston, who is an important Black anarchist. I think he's one of the ones you should become acquainted with or become familiar with if you are going to start learning about Black anarchism. A very important thinker. He is still alive. And I would also recommend, even though it's not on this list because it's not in a transcript format and it's a reading list, he also gives a wonderful speech that is about his experience in the Black Panthers and having gone to visit the Zapatistas. So if you just kind of like YouTube Zapatista Alston, Alston, Zapatista, or Black Panthers, Zapatistas, Ashanti Alston, or something along those lines, you'll probably get the speech. It's excellent. I think it's probably one of the most important speeches I've watched. And Alston gives really good speeches, as is evidenced by this one being included here. But it's essentially just him kind of laying out some of the basics of Black anarchism for people that may be curious. And once again, just how that's important to the struggle of Black people in the United States. The next one, kind of on that same topic, just insofar as we're giving like an introduction to what Black anarchism is is What is Black Anarchism by Andrewism, which you may recognize as being like Saint Andrew or something, you know, he's had a couple different names or ways of putting it. But I think What is Black Anarchism is probably one of the best primers you're going to find on a little bit of history about Black anarchism. Where did it come from? Who are its key thinkers? But also just like, what is the theory contained in Black anarchism? So it's a little more wide spanning, I would say, than what Alston is doing. But it's also an excellent introduction to what Black anarchism is. And because he is a YouTuber, you can also find this as a YouTube video. And, I recommend watching it. It's also excellent. I should mention, we also table this one as a zine. And I recommend tabling it as a zine. It goes very quick. People tend to pick this one up. I think just the title, What is Black Anarchism, kind of makes people... it just seems like, oh, it's going to answer my question, right? It's right to the point. And of course it does. It's a great primer. The next one on the list is Anarchism and the Black Revolution by Lorenzo Gamboa Ervin. And I just want to emphasize that this is one of the most important books on the entire list. And I know that is a bold claim, and I want to emphasize, I mean, over the entire reading list from the very beginning, all these parts together, it's one of the most important books. Anarchism and the Black Revolution is not only an excellent introduction to anarchism, especially if you get the definitive edition, which I recommend. If you buy it, buy Anarchism and the Black Revolution definitive edition. It is an excellent introduction to anarchism. It is relatively plain language, which is to say, I think it can be understood by a broad number of people, but it is a full-size theoretical text. And it not only is an introduction to anarchism, it also kind of gives us an introduction to issues of white supremacy and the struggle of Black Americans. And I should emphasize that most of its content is really oriented towards the struggle of Black Americans. So it doesn't have like a whole lot of discussion about, the diaspora. But there is a little bit of that added in the definitive edition. So once again, I just really want to emphasize, if you buy the book, buy the definitive edition. It is an incredibly important text for a variety of reasons. And I want to kind of intimate what I've said before about it. And that is, it is not only... speaking to Black radicals who might be interested in Black anarchism, it is written with a lot of conversation and dialogue or discourse that is really valuable to white anarchists. Okay, I think that's a big part of it. One of the things I'd really like to emphasize to a lot of people who are watching this is that, this is not just like the Holy Bible for Black anarchists, even though I think, to some degree you might see it that way, but it's also extremely valuable for helping white anarchists understand where they are oriented in the struggle and how they can actually, struggle together successfully with Black anarchists and understand their orientation by contrast. So it is extremely valuable. And lastly, if all it did was that, it would be an incredible text. But it also has like some really important commentary for people who come from a more authoritarian perspective. It explains why Lorenzo Gamboa Ervin is no longer an authoritarian leftist, which I suppose I should note. Lorenzo Gamboa Ervin was a Black Panther. And so he was brought up in Maoism and very well educated on Marxist theory. And he came to anarchism instead. I should mention that's also true for Ashanti Alston earlier in this list. And it is also true for another author that will be in this list. You might notice that this is a common story. So the Black anarchist tradition contains a scathing critique of authoritarian leftism and also its orientation within Black revolutionary struggle. So it contains all of these things. Okay, it's an excellent book. I think it is a must read, personally. One of the most important books for you to read on this entire list. I think you could learn an enormous amount from it, almost no matter who you are. So that's actually a great place for us to end this video. We still have 2 more on this list for Black anarchism. And if you return next time, we'll go into those. But I hope that this was informative for you. If I haven't already mentioned it, the link to this reading list is down in the description, so it's just available to you there. I tried to find, like PDFs or just some link to this for all of these, and a few of these even like videos associated with them. If you enjoyed this, please go give it a like. If you have any commentary, ideas, thoughts, please go, comment down below. I'd also like to say, if you like this, there's more of this on the channel, go become a subscriber. And lastly, if you think what I'm doing here is important, if you think that you want me to be able to do more of this work and devote more of my time to making videos like this, please go become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Anark. And that is it. That's the spiel. I am done for today. I'll see you next week.